Welcome to the Four Lakes Church of Christ in Madison, Wisconsin. We're glad to have you back with us for our midweek Bible study. Today we're continuing in our study of the book of Ruth, and so we hope you will find a Bible and be turning with us to Ruth chapter 2. We'll be there in just a moment, but as always, if you have any questions, any comments about tonight's class, if you have something we need to be praying about as a church, if we can encourage you spiritually, we invite you to get in touch. You can send me a message to info@fourlakeschurch.org. You can also call or send a text to 608-224-0274, and we would love to hear from you. By the way, I have mentioned this a time or two before, but we have a brother in the Lord who is preparing to head out and around the moon in the very near future, if he hasn't left already. Victor Glover is in the back middle in this picture. He's a member of the Lord's Church down in the Houston area, and he's serving as a pilot on the Artemis II crew. And I'm recording this on Tuesday, and as of now, the launch is not supposed to happen until sometime after 6:30 Wednesday evening Eastern Standard Time on April 1st. So there's a lot we don't know. There's a window as to when this can happen, so who knows when it'll happen if it does, but I think the mission is supposed to take around 10 days or so, and hopefully we'll have an update on this on Sunday. But just kind of one of our own who's been in the news, and certainly we wish him the best and keep him and his crew in our prayers. But again, we're continuing in our study of Ruth this week. Last week we talked about some of the challenges of being an immigrant, being shunned or rejected by the local people. There's certainly a level of discrimination that happens really and has throughout world history toward people who are not like us. Maybe being overwhelmed by some of the differences in the culture, maybe another challenge of being an immigrant. We may face a language barrier. We may face the prospect of being taken advantage of because of all of these things combined. And yet, even with the difficulties, people continue to move from one place to another, even across national boundaries, for business or pleasure, maybe to provide for our families, maybe to escape unjust or religious or political persecution, or maybe just to escape just punishment. There are some people who are fleeing the law and may go from one nation to another in order to avoid that. So we discuss these things because the book of Ruth is about some immigrants who had fled to a foreign land due to a famine. So there was a lack of food in Israel, so they had to flee to the nearby land of Moab. And the focus of this story is a woman by the name of Ruth. And we learn in the Bible the book of Ruth is located immediately after the book of Judges. That period of the Judges was a time of lawlessness and chaos, but we also learned that ordinary, average, everyday Israelites continued living their lives. And that's certainly what we find and what we see in the book of Ruth. And they faced their own challenges that weren't necessarily affected directly by the political situation in the world at that time. To summarize, we have Elimelech and Naomi, an Israelite couple from Bethlehem. They flee to Moab during a time of famine, even though the Moabites were enemies of Israel. So we will do desperate things when we're hungry, and we see this. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh, a pagan god to whom the Moabites would offer child sacrifices. And so a couple weeks ago when we started Ruth, we talked about the Moabite stone, or the Mesha Stele, as it's sometimes referred to, a basalt monument commemorating a Moabite king's victory over Israel. And they would fight back and forth, so sometimes the Moabites would win, sometimes the Israelites would win. And so this was on and off through the years. Well, Elimelech and Naomi have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and eventually Elimelech, the father, dies, leaving Naomi a widow. So when these two young men grow up, they then marry two Moabite women by the names of Orpah and Ruth. And eventually, Mahlon and Chilion die, and now we have three widows. So we have Naomi, the Israelite, along with her daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. And we ended our study a couple weeks ago with these three heading back to Bethlehem. On the way to Bethlehem, however, Naomi realizes that these young women have no real connection to Israel. In other words, why am I bringing them back with me? It's not in their best interest necessarily to return, because they're not returning. They've never been there before. They need to just maybe stay back with their own people and find husbands and kind of get on with life and put this family behind them. Well, She realizes that this isn't the best thing, so she says, "You two just need to go back." Well, Orpah very quickly agrees and returns. Like, I'm out of here. I'm gonna go back to my old gods, and I'm just gonna forget this whole thing and go home. Ruth, however, insists on staying with Naomi and heading back to Bethlehem, where she will now be the immigrant as a young widow. Well, as Ruth puts it, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you will go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." And so Ruth then returns to Israel with Naomi. And in the very last verse in Ruth 1, we find that Naomi and Ruth both return to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Well, this sets us up for what happens next. Before we start with Ruth 2, though, I want us to realize that chapter 1 spans a period of at least 10 years. So we have a famine, we have a move, we have the death of a spouse, we have the two sons getting married, we have those sons dying. And then we have these three widows coming out on the other side of the famine. So it's a 10-year minimum span of time in one chapter. In chapter 2, though, what we're looking at in this week's class, we slow it way down. And in chapter 2, we plan on covering only one 24-hour period. And I just find that interesting how the time is different from chapter 1 to chapter 2. So it's moving very, very slowly in chapter 1, but we're just speeding through it in chapter 2. All right, Ruth chapter 2, let's look together tonight at verses 1 through 7. Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Well, right away up in verse 1, we're introduced to a new character. So now we're introduced to this guy by the name of Boaz. And all we know about Boaz at this point is that he is somehow related to Naomi's dead husband, and that Boaz is a man of great wealth. So he's wealthy, and he has some connection by marriage to Naomi and her family, to her husband's family. Meanwhile, in verse 2, Ruth is asking Naomi's permission to go glean in a field belonging to someone in whose sight I may find favor. And if this is all we had, I don't know exactly how to take that. It may be, "Help me find a husband," or it might just be, "Please let me get some grain without getting murdered." So I don't know which way we would go with that if this was all that we had. So either way, we know that Ruth is about to go gleaning. So she's going to go pick some grain. We aren't given too much information here, but from Leviticus 19 verses 9 and 10, we know that God gave his people an interesting way to provide for the poor. And I think most of us, especially those of you who are joining us in this class, I mean, you're kind of hardcore if you're if you're watching a live stream, here April 1st in Madison, Wisconsin. But I think most of us know that God's way of dealing with the poor and the widows and the orphans and the strangers or the immigrants, this goes back to Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. And back in Leviticus, this is what the text says. "Now when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God." And we have something similar in Deuteronomy 24, 19 through 22. The Bible says, when you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow. And so I just want us to notice that's the scriptural background here. When the Israelites went to harvest their land, they were not to harvest to the very corners. So if we're thinking today in terms of a tractor, instead of going to the corner and hanging a hard left, they would kind of round it off and they would leave the corners for the poor. And so also, if they missed something on the first pass, they were not to go back to get it, but they were to leave that for the poor as well, and for the widows, for the orphans, for the strangers, or the aliens. And so does Ruth qualify? Does she fall in that category? Absolutely. As I understand it, she hits 3 out of the 4, and maybe 4 out of 4. I mean, she's a widow, she's poor because she's gleaning, she's a stranger, and we don't know about her parents, so she could be an orphan, but at least 3 out of the 4 categories here. I would point out, though, that landowners were not required to harvest the food and drop it off at the front door of those who were poor, and the widows and orphans and the strangers. And so let's just notice that from a practical point of view. Instead, those in need of that food actually had to do something to go get it. And I do think there is wisdom in God's plan here. There is certainly dignity in work. There is a value in doing something for what we receive, even if it is minimal. So even the poor have a responsibility to work if they are able. Well, in verse 3, we finally have the first link between Boaz and Ruth, as Ruth just so happened to come to a field belonging to Boaz. And I think this may be a good time for us to consider the difference between God's providence and a miracle. A miracle is when God sets aside the law of nature to do something amazing. God's providence is when God uses natural means to accomplish something. And there is a difference. And to me, this is clearly providence. This is not miraculous. So we don't have some amazing thing, nobody's walking on water or, nothing like that is happening here. But on the other hand, it does seem to me that God almost certainly had some role in what happens here. So I wouldn't swear my soul on it, not to that level, but it seems to be God perhaps coordinating this. I mean, from Ruth's perspective, of course, this connection simply happened. And from her point of view, that's how God's providence works. God provides for us, but it's not necessarily through a flaming angel delivering food to our front door. But instead, God provides in a way that may be hard to nail down at the time. And I would add, sometimes God's providence seems a little bit clearer in hindsight. In other words, it may look rather random at the moment, but when we look back on it a few months, years, even decades later, we suddenly realize God was providing for us when this happened in my life. So we may not nail it down at the moment, but it seems to get clearer over time. That's just my observation based on a number of years of experience. If you think, for example, about the situation with Philemon, we have a runaway slave who finds Paul in Rome, and there's a lot we don't know. It seems that perhaps he obeys the gospel through Paul's influence in Rome. Paul then sends the slave back to his master, not as a slave, but as a brother. And as he writes that letter to the owner or to the master, Paul is able to say that perhaps God had something to do with that. And I just find it interesting that even Paul, as an inspired apostle, even he refuses to nail it down. He doesn't say God did this, but he says perhaps. And so we refer to this as the providential perhaps. Maybe, or perhaps God seems to have played a role in this. And I would say so also today. It's not that God miraculously takes care of our needs, but certainly looking back on some situations in our lives, a lot of us are able to say, it sure seems that God is the one who worked that out for us. In our own life, I've told you before, I think of us building a new house down in Janesville. We had no money for appliances for the first few months. We had a small dorm fridge. We had a hole where the gas stove was supposed to go. But once we could afford a fridge, several months into our new time at that new house, it came with a free ice maker. And that was a luxury that I had never had before. And so here's this brand new, this ice maker is in there. However, we couldn't afford to hook it up. I mean, we couldn't afford the water pipe and the valve and the hose and all that. And so I priced out the copper pipes and the fittings at the hardware store. And when I came home that night, I told my wife, the next time we have $20, we can afford to put in the ice maker. And the next morning, as I remembered, it might have been that afternoon, but I was raking leaves in the backyard when I looked down and I saw a $20 bill in that pile of leaves. And I ran inside and I said to my wife, God wants us to have an ice maker. And I went out, I got the parts, I started sweating copper and I installed it, and we joked about that. But did God provide for us that day? Absolutely he did. Was it a miracle? No. Did God suspend the laws of nature in order to, make this $20 bill appear in our backyard? Nothing like that. I had to work for providing the fridge. I had to work at raking those leaves. I had to price out the parts. I had to install those parts and so on. But ultimately, looking back on it, I know God had to be involved in that. God provides for his people. And so also with Ruth. I hesitate to spoil the rest of the book, but I think, as I said, we're hardcore tonight. You know how this book ends. Most of us do. Ruth is going to end up as King David's grandmother. That puts her in the genealogy of Jesus. Can we think of some reason why God might want Ruth in Jesus' family tree? Why is this important? In my opinion, it's a bit of foreshadowing that the gospel would be universal. That the Gentiles, that is, the outsiders, non-Jewish people, would be included and welcomed into God's family. And so at the time, it certainly seemed like chance that Ruth just so happened to land in a field belonging to Boaz. But looking back on it, it sure seems to me that God might have had something to do with that. And I hope you agree with that. Let me know if you have any comments on that. In verse 4, by the way, we learn that Boaz apparently believes in Yahweh. So it's just a little detail here. He comes back to check on the gleaners, and he says, "May the Lord be with you." So in the New American Standard, that's all capital letters. And so he's saying he's using God's covenant or personal name in that saying. And so this is apparently something he would say maybe on a regular basis because his workers respond. And in the following verses, we also find that Boaz seems to take an interest in Ruth. So that's something else that we learn about Boaz here. So he sees her, and he notices her, and he wants to know more about her. And this isn't in a creepy kind of way that Bathsheba and David were involved in. This is not David and, his harassment of Bathsheba. That's not what's going on here. He's not taking advantage of this woman, but he's asking about her. And the foreman of the servants explains who she is and what she's been doing. So this interest, though, is about to escalate a little bit. So let's continue with Ruth 2, verses 8 through 13. Ruth 2, 8 through 13. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go in to glean another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth, and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." So just to clarify, she's not an orphan, is she? I thought that was a possibility. I'd forgotten what was coming in this paragraph here. But anyway, just beyond noticing Ruth, Boaz now invites her to stay in his field, and he lets her know that he's commanded his servants not to touch her. So he's protecting her. He's looking out for her. And then he tells her to drink water from what the servants draw. And so not only is he protecting her physically, he's now providing for her. in a way that seems above and beyond. So the law just required landowners simply leave the leftovers. Um, Boaz has gone beyond that now, isn't he? So he's providing both water and protection. Well, at this point, Ruth is maybe a little concerned, maybe a little bit surprised, and she wants to know why. Why are you doing this for me? Maybe a little skeptical, I don't know, maybe kind of shocked or surprised. And Boaz explains that he's doing this because Ruth has a reputation. She's known for taking care of her mother in law after the death of her husband. So, kind of connected to this a little bit, I remember my grandfather telling me that as I was dating and considering marriage, I need to pay attention to how a young woman treats her parents. And his advice to me was that that right there is a good indicator of what kind of person she is and how she might treat me in the future. So, if she's just really cutting on her parents and speaking evil against them and all that. I think my grandfather was saying that's a red flag. You need to be aware of that. So let that be a warning to you. And so I think that's something that Boaz is looking at Ruth, and he's attracted to that she did such a good job of taking care of Naomi, her mother-in-law. All right, and then Boaz also knows that Ruth has left the land of her birth and has come to this land that's foreign to her. And so Boaz then gives Ruth a blessing from the Lord. He wants the Lord to provide for her because she has come to seek refuge under the wings of the Lord. Let's remember that in Ruth 1:16, Ruth had said to Naomi that your God will be my God. And so Ruth then had adopted the faith of the Israelites. So she was a foreigner, but she was also a believer, wasn't she? And this actually reminds me of Psalm 61, written by King David, a descendant of Ruth. So Ruth's, I guess, grandson or great grandson. Anyway, and so David, with some Moabite blood in him, I think we would say that, is able to write, perhaps thinking of his grandmother, "Hear my cry, O God, give heed to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been a refuge for me. A tower of strength against the enemy. Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you have heard my vows, O God. You have given me the inheritance of those who fear your name. You will prolong the king's life. His years will be as many generations. He will abide before God forever. Appoint loving kindness and truth that they may preserve him. So I will sing praise to your name forever, that I may pay my vows day by day." And again, this is from the family from a few generations later. And we sing about this sometimes, don't we? God be with you till we meet again. Neath his wings securely hide you. Daily manna still provide you. God be with you till we meet again. It's a biblical concept to take refuge under God's wings. So think about a bird protecting its, little birds. And those wings are protection from the weather, maybe from predators. But God so also protects those who come to him for help. And that's what Ruth has done. She has come to God for protection, and Boaz can certainly see that. All right, let's continue with Ruth 2, verses 14, 15, and 16. Ruth 2, starting in verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." In verse 14, Boaz now takes it to the next level, doesn't he? I mean, he's big time flirting. As they're eating together, Boaz invites Ruth to eat some bread and dip it in his vinegar. That is so romantic. We need to try that on our next date night. Kind of interesting what their culture, it was an invitation to kind of share very closely in this meal. Beyond this, he also serves her roasted grain. And this lady's just a foreigner and, doesn't really belong here in a sense, but he's going above and beyond. And then he tells the servants to let her glean among the sheaves and not insult her. So she's no longer picking up leftovers, is she? She's now invited to participate in the harvest, but for herself. And then even beyond this, Boaz tells his servants to intentionally take some grain out of the sheaves and lay those down there in her path, and not to rebuke her when she picks them up. And obviously, if she had done this without being invited to do it, she would deserve a rebuke. That's not what gleaning is. I mean, the law allowed for the picking up of leftovers, but Boaz is certainly going above and beyond for this young woman. All right, let's conclude by taking a look at Ruth 2, 17 through 23, the last paragraph in chapter 2. Ruth 2, 17 through 23. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Naomi pardon me, just got a call on the line here. "The name of the man with whom you work today is Boaz." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." Again Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative, he is one of our closest relatives." Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "Furthermore he said to me, 'You should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids, so that others do not fall upon you in another field." So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, in verse 17, we find Ruth gleans in the field all day, comes away with about an ephah of barley, a little less than a bushel, so I mean, it's quite the load. And we might wonder how Ruth is feeling about all this. She's probably a bit nervous, if we could put ourselves in her shoes or her sandals. Maybe excited, not knowing what's going to happen next, but she shows this to her mother-in-law. They share the barley. Naomi wants to know, "Where did you get this?" This is obviously a little more than we were expecting. And Ruth explains, and when Naomi finds out about Boaz, she says that God, through Boaz, has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and the dead. And that's a reference to Boaz honoring not just Ruth and Naomi, but also their husbands who had died, isn't it? So I think that's the dead reference. And we might think of Jesus making provisions for his mother even as he was on the cross. Jesus cared for his mother, who was a widow at that point, we assume. There's no reference to Joseph after Jesus was 12 years old. Back in Exodus 22, 21 through 24, God had said through Moses, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan, if you afflict him at all. And if he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry, and my anger will be kindled, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless." And so God had some pretty strong feelings toward caring for women who've lost their husbands, didn't he? And Naomi sees this care coming through Boaz toward her and toward Ruth. And I think just a practical reminder, there is a value for us also caring for widows and orphans. And I don't know if we can put ourselves in other shoes. Some of you are in that position. But if we can imagine what might this person appreciate and then do that. If we could invite a widow, out to lunch, or if we could drop something off, or if we could make a call or send a text or whatever it may be. I think that may be a practical lesson from this chapter. Be a Boaz and try to help others as he was doing. Naomi then informs Ruth that Boaz is one of their closest relatives. So this is some bonus information that'll be important shortly. And Ruth then says Boaz has told her to stay close to his servants throughout the harvest, and Naomi agrees. Stay close to his servants so you don't get attacked out there in the field somewhere. This is the safe thing to do. And this brings us back to the fact that this takes place during the time of the judges. And so let's not forget that connection. I think we talked about this book being perhaps plugged in somewhere around the time of Gideon. And so people did whatever was right in their own eyes. If it felt good, they did it. If it hurt other people, who cares? We're just going to do what's best for me. So it was a dangerous, lawless time. And we know this not just due to the multiple warnings in this book, but we also think about what happened to the Levite's concubine back in the closing chapters of Judges. So, it was just a terrible time. And so Ruth then lives with her mother-in-law, and works with the servants of Boaz throughout the barley harvest. So this would have gone on, I'm assuming, for probably several weeks. All right, this brings us to the end of Ruth 2, and this also brings us back to our graphic for this study. Don't know if you noticed that or made the connection. Hopefully you do now. We have a woman gathering grain in a field somewhere. And I think this gives us another very practical lesson, practical reminder here, and that is Ruth is no slacker, is she? Ruth is a hard worker. She doesn't lay around feeling sorry for herself. She doesn't lay around waiting for somebody to bring her food, but she's out there getting it done. And she's even taking care of her mother-in-law throughout this. So not just herself, but she's caring for somebody else. And so there is no dishonor in hard work. By the way, I've mentioned this before. I need to mention it again since we're talking about this. But I've actually done some gleaning. Back when I was a kid, my dad got a call on the church phone down in Crystal Lake from a farmer just north of the church building where I grew up. And the farmer said, I think his equipment had missed some corn or something had happened, and that if the church had any poor people, they were welcome to come get it. And I think it was at that point I realized we were poor. And so Dad took us out in that field near McHenry County College off of Highway 14, and we gleaned. And so we talk about gleaning in the book of Ruth. We have done some gleaning in our family. And you know what? God provided for us that day. It wasn't miraculous. God didn't drop ears of corn on our front porch. We had to go get it. But I know looking back on it, absolutely, God provided for us through his providence. And so also with Ruth and Naomi through the hand of Boaz. All right, next week we want to continue with Ruth chapter 3. As always, if there's something we need to be praying about as a church, if we can help or encourage you some way, get in touch. Send an email, info@fourlakeschurch.org. You can also call or send a text to 608-224-0274. As we close, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful for your word tonight. We're especially thankful to learn more about your providential care for your people. We know that as the Lord of all the earth, you are responsible for providing every good thing that we need, from the food that we eat to the air that we breathe. We're also thankful for the example of Ruth, for her hard work and her persistence, for her faith in you, for her care of her mother-in-law. Thank you also for Boaz, for the wealth that you provided to that man, allowing him to share, to be in a position to help others. And thank you, Father, for Naomi as well, for her influence, for her guidance, leading her daughter-in-law toward you and toward your people. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. We come to you in his name. Amen.